All right. Welcome. Thanks for coming today on this. I was hoping it'd be a sunny day, but whatever kind of day this actually is. Thanks to Joel and Cedarburg History Museum for inviting me. My name is Reed Perkins. Most of you know me, actually, so I'll keep the introduction short. Among other things, I am the historian for the Jonathan Clark House Museum just down the road. My work there is focused on the early pioneers of the Clark House and Beckman in the very early decades of European American settlement, namely the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. This very early era of local settlement features many individuals and families from the English-speaking parts of America and Europe. It is the next generation of immigrants, although there were German immigrants as early as the 1830s. It's the next generation of immigrants that gave Ozaki County its lasting character as a German-American community. Today, I'm going to talk about someone who exemplifies how history is not strictly divided into eras or ethnicities or lines on a map. Today's subject is an example of how early Yankee and Anglo-American settlement in our county made way for German-American immigrant farmers and businessmen and women, and led to the Cedarburg we know today. So I picked Fred Beckman. Who is Fred Beckman? Well, it all started with a photocopy of an obituary found by Clark House director Diana J. Look, which she passed along to me about 10 years ago. It was from the local archives, probably clipped from the Cedarburg paper, and dated in a later hand, March 13th, 1912. Like many obituaries, there were many more or less accurate details of the life of the deceased and clues to many other pieces of the historical puzzle. The obituary began in the usual way. Died at his home in the city at an early hour this morning, Fred Beckman Sr., after an illness of about 9 months, age 66 years. And as I read on, this caught my eye. In 1868, he was united in marriage with Lena Hackfelt, and shortly after their marriage, removed on the Clark Farm, 2 miles south of this city, now owned by the Doyle brothers. Well, that would be the Jonathan Clark House and Farm, one of the county's earliest farms and most historic buildings. I wanted to know more about this Fred Beckman, and I also wanted to try and understand how his story intersects with the stories of the county's earliest pioneers. So I did some research, and today I'd like to sketch for you the life of early Cedarburg pioneer Fred Beckman, a life in 4 chapters. Fred Beckman led an interesting life, one that exemplified many of the most important themes in our local Mequon and Cedarburg history. In particular, his life makes clear the many connections between the history of the Jonathan Clark House, the Hamilton Mill, the Concordia Mill, and the early days of downtown Cedarburg, and the importance of family and community support along the way. So let's start at the beginning in Germany. Friedrich Beckman was born in Mecklenburg-Strelitz, Germany on July 30th, 1845, says the obituary. Where is that exactly? The short and only kind of correct answer is Germany. Because before 1871, Germany was just a concept. It was actually a collection of 30 or so kingdoms, duchies, principalities, and so forth, only vaguely united by something like a common language. Here from that previous map is a list for you, for those of you keeping score. We happen to be interested in map numbers 19 and 20, Mecklenburg-Schwerin and Mecklenburg-Strelitz. That's the pink bit at the top center of this map. Those are the Grand Duchies of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, apparently the more successful side of the family. They held about 4/5 of the area, and the cousins from Mecklenburg-Strelitz. The Grand Duchy of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, number 19, occupied, like I said, about 4/5 of the area. Strelitz, you can see on the right, number 20. And in particular, Fred Beckman was born on the manorial estate called Farren, located southeast of Bismarck. But it's so small, it's not on this map. But it is mapped and described in Meyer's Local and Traffic Dictionary of the German Empire, published in 4 volumes between 1871 and 1918. It's the little bit at the tip of the arrow, the red arrow down there. That's Ferry. According to Myers, it is a so-called allodial gut, or inherited estate, located in Mecklenburg-Schwerin, not, as in Fred's biography, Mecklenburg-Strelitz. This is the first of many minor discrepancies people run into while studying Fred Beckman's life and the lives of his family. By the way, if you have any German relatives and you want to know something about where they came from, you want to go online to myersgaz.org, and I can share that with you, or just Google it under Myers Works. And it's the fabulous bilingual website. You'll go automatically to the English-speaking version, and it couldn't be more informative, and it's got the best maps, the most detailed maps available. There were, by the way, 112 people living in Ferrin when the Myers-Orts did their mapping in 1871. Mecklenburg was, in the 19th century, by all accounts, a beautiful place with excellent, established, and productive farms. Yet, so many emigrated from the Grand Duchies to America during the 19th century. You wonder why? Well, Mecklenburg, like many of the German states, was still organized and run with an almost feudal-style system. The peasant farmers, and they were peasants, were tied to the land. The official end of serfdom did not come until, any guesses? 1820. Following the end of serfdom, though, things got worse for most farmers. The local nobles still owned all the land, and now they were not even obligated to meet at least some kind of basic food and shelter needs for their tenant farmers and their families. The economic consequences for many were a lack of housing in particular, and a lack of adequate food. Life in mid-century Mecklenburg became unsustainable for many, many, many peasant farmers. So Fred, as his obituary states, came to America with his step-parents, brother, and sister on October 2, 1860. In fact, on the ship's manifest, dated October 1, 1860, there were 8 immigrants in Fred's family leaving Hamburg for New York City. I know all of you are fluent at reading cursive bureaucratic handwriting from Germany at the time. But by the way, on the whole page, there are 37 passengers listed. All of them are from Mecklenburg. The blended Schultz and Beckman family can be found on lines 30 through 37. There are 8 family members listed here. Starting from the top, Johann Schultz, age 28 or maybe 36. The next record is different. His wife, Carolina, 36, and their children, Friedrich Schultz, age 2, and Christiana Schultz, who was an infant under the age of 1. Next are their stepchildren, quote unquote. Carl, age 17, Friedrich, our man, age 15, sister Carolina, age 12, and Wilhelmina, 10, and the last 4 are all surnamed Beckman. Since the father of this group, Johann Schultz, is not surnamed Beckman, the assumption is that Carolina Schultz is the mother of all the children and stepchildren. The only reason to doubt this is that Fred Beckman's marriage register later on in the decade records his mother's name as Maria. This may be easily explained by noting that how many 19th century Germans had 2, 3, or more baptismal names in addition to the family name. So Carolina Schultz may well be one and the same as Fred Beckman's mother, whom he referred to as Maria Beckman. No research is needed. The Schultz-Beckman family was at sea for almost 8 weeks, arriving in New York on November 30th, 1860. They spent most of their time below decks in steerage, as in this engraving. Yeah, so the next time you fly, and I know it's bad, at least it's not 8 weeks in steerage. From time to time, weather permitting, they might catch some fresh air on deck. Or get seasick, who knows, I have no idea. After 8 weeks at sea, the ship arrived in New York City, probably at Castle Gardens, the immigration station at the south end of Manhattan, where a battery park downstairs. And that is an 1858 arrival, so it looked very much something like that. They arrived in New York City on November 30th, 1860. This is the official passenger list for their ship, the sailing ship Oder, a burden of 667 tons from that arrival. All 8 Schultzes and Beckmans survived the voyage. Not everybody did. That's on this elsewhere in the manifest. Fred headed directly to Ozaukee County. It appears that brother Carl and sister Mina did also. What happened to the others is not clear to me. Fred Beckman, according to his obituary, came to America with his step-parents, brother and sister on October 2, 1860, arriving in the end of November, settling at Hamilton in this town, meaning the town of Cedarburg. Big town, not village of Cedarburg. He found employment at the grist mill owned at the grist mill by, as the obituary calls him, the late Andrew Bodendorfer. He was quite alive at the time, where Fred worked as a teamster for nearly 8 years. The small hamlet of Hamilton, originally called New Dublin, is located at the intersection of Green Bay Road and Cedar Creek in the southeast quarter of Section 35 of this township. The original patentees were New York speculator Anne Jean Noyes, who is not mentioned in any of the official histories, but there she is, who owned the left half of that quarter section, and the curmudgeonly Joseph Gardner, who's really the earliest permanent settler in Hamilton. By the way, the most comprehensive version of what happened next can be found in the well-researched but not infallible National Register of Historic Places nomination for the Hamilton Historic District from 1976. If we have time, I have more bonus information on the mill and the district, and we can look into that. The mill was built by Edvard Janssen in 1854 on the site of one of the area's earliest sawmills that were built in 1847. Sometime after 1854, Janssen sold the mill. On September 1st, 1862, the Concordia mill, with its mill pond, dam, and adjacent 10 acres, were purchased by Andrew Bodendorfer from the then owners, Eustace and Amelia Reinhold, for $3,000. So, in fact, Fred Beckman's first job in America was as a teamster at the Hamilton mill, but his first boss was probably not Andrew Bodendorfer, but the then owners, Mr. and Mrs. Reinhold. I know nothing about the Reinholds. They are ghosts on the records so far. Fred Beckman lived and worked in Hamilton for much of the 1860s, from age 15 to about age 23. Brother Carl Beckman also lived somewhere in Hamilton before establishing his farm in Town 10, Range 10 North, Range 21 East, this township, Section 25, which is officially in Grafton on the maps, but it belongs to this township. Between Hamilton and the village of Grafton, right along Green Bay Road. And note, by the way, in the 1873-74 map, which I put down there, just to the east of Carl's farm is the farm of one C. Schultz. Could this be one of the stepbrothers? I have no idea yet. Fred worked as a teamster for nearly 8 years, says the obituary. What did that entail? Teamsters were the long and short haul truckers of their day. They drove a team of horses or oxen hitched to a wagon or sledge containing goods of all sorts. A teamster working for a mill might make trips back and forth to and from the mill, bringing raw grain from the farms to the mill and delivering ground grains stored into sacks or barrels back to the customer. Mill work and the necessary travel were often done in winter when the roads are cold and hard and able to withstand heavy loads. Here's a close-up from that previous Courier and Ives lithograph of a horse pulling a sledge filled with sacks stuffed, we presume, with freshly ground flour. Sacks were a thing, definitely. Barrels were by far the most common container for moving things throughout most of the 19th century. And then the U-lines invented cardboard boxes.
Just after that.
And by the way, if your horsepower isn't strong enough, then a pair of hard-working oxen will do the job. Oxen were, by the way, in 1850, 10 times more populous in Ozaukee County than horses. Um, Horses came to be used more on farms in the later decades. The America of the early 1860s really was a land of opportunity, and it was good to the immigrant Beckman family. Unfortunately, they had very little time to settle into their new lives. Remember, they arrived in November of 1860, because guess what happens in April of 1861? The Civil War breaks out. They probably had no idea what they were in. I don't need to tell anybody at a history museum that the Civil War was the central event in 19th century American history, including in Ozaukee County, and we're still fighting the Civil War today. It's just really big. Many Germans emigrated to the United States to avoid compulsory military service back home in Germany. Carl and Fred Beckman, Carl was 17, Fred was 15, may have come to the U.S. in part because they were getting to be just about draft age in Germany. Ozaukee County, as you may or may not know, was also the scene of one of the major U.S. draft riots in 1862 up at Fort Washington. Many German immigrants were involved, however, many others served the Union and served with distinction and great pride, including Fred's future brother-in-law, Charles Gottschalk, his father-in-law-to-be, Henry Hopfeld, that's kind of the father-in-law-to-be, Henry Hopfeld, and his brother, Carl Beckman, who served as either Carl and or Charles Beckman. We'll hear more about that. Here, by the way, we have the 1890 special veterans censuses for Charles Gottschalk, Henry Hopfeld, and brother Carl or Charles Beckman. The information collected on this special 1890 census included the dates of service and the units served in and other information. The notes for Charles Beckman's schedule, down in the bottom line at the bottom right there, indicates that he was shot through leg during the war. All three of Fred Beckman's close relatives that served received Civil War pensions, which, by the way, are a huge source of genealogical and biographical information if you have a relative that served. According to the index cards, because I don't have the pensions, brother Carl, or Charles Beckman, having been shot in the leg during the war, received an invalid's pension in 1881 at the young age of 37. Father-in-law, and this would be Fred Beckman's father-in-law, Henry Hatchfeld, received his invalid's pension in 1889. He was the oldest of the Beckman relatives that fought. He was 45 years old when he enlisted and 71 years old when he received his pension. His brother-in-law, Charles Gottschalk, received his invalid's pension in 1891. He was only 47 years old. Following the war, civilian life resumed, and our immigrants began to find their life partners. I'm calling it the year of marriage. 1868, by coincidence or otherwise, became the big year of marriages for our extended family. First up, in May 1868, was the marriage of Katharina Richtbers, or Richtbers, the widow Adler, with one Gustav Podol. Fred, by the way, as you can see down in the lower line there, was one of the two witnesses at this event. And we'll have more on the Gustav and Catherine Podol and their relationship to the Beckman family in a bit. Keep the word Richtbers, the family name Richtbers, in mind because there's a lot of them. Meanwhile, there were more weddings ahead in 1868. 1868 was also marrying time for the immigrant Beckman brothers. First up was older brother Carl Beckman and his bride, Christina Valburger Pirkner. They were married in Germantown, probably Christina's home, I didn't have time to figure that out, on July 26, 1868. By the way, on the marriage register, Carl's home was recorded as Hamilton. That's how we knew, at least in 1868, he was living somewhere in Hamilton. The witnesses, by the way, were Carl's brother Fred Beckman and Carl or Charles Gottschalk of Civil War fame. That fall, on October 2nd, 1868, Fred Beckman married Henry Hatfeld's daughter, Lena. In 1868, it had been an eventful year for Fred Beckman and his friends and relatives, and it was time for the newlyweds, Fred and Lena, to make some big changes. But first, 2 weeks later, on October 18th, 1869, Sister Wilhelmina or Mina Beckman married Charles Gottschalk. Their first child, Charles Jr., was born in September of that same year. On the 1870 census, Charles is a 25-year-old teamster, another teamster in the family. 1 year after the census, in 1871, he will begin operating what will become the Gottschalk Livery Stable across Washington Street from the Wisconsin House. A decade later, it will be considered as the largest livery in Ozaukee County. By fall 1873, Fred Beckman, like his new brother-in-law Charles Gottschalk, decided he'd had enough of driving a team for a living, and it was time for farming. And luckily for Fred and Nina, an established farm with a substantial farmhouse was available for rent just a few miles away. In the 1840s, farm and the 1848 stone house belonging to Mary Turk Clark and her daughters, the heirs of Mary's late husband, Jonathan M. Clark, the Beckmans found their new home. The farm, as you may well know, was located on the southeast border of Section 3, town of Mequon, and it had occupied an important place in the early history of pioneer settlement in the county. Jonathan Clark was born in 1812 in the area where northern Vermont and southern Quebec meet. At age 21, he enlisted in the U.S. Army and was stationed in Wisconsin, Fort Howard, Green Bay, where he served for 3 years and ended up helping to build the military road between Fort Howard and Fond du Lac. His future wife, Mary Turk, was born in 1821 along the Hudson River in New York State. Her family was of Dutch and Anglo-American descent. Mary was the oldest of 8 children of Peter and Rachel Turk. Peter Turk's family, including Mary, was one of the first white settler families in Mequon, arriving in 1837. When Jonathan Clark settled in Mequon in 1839, he purchased 80 acres of government land. Jonathan Clark and Mary Turk were married in 1840. They most likely lived in a modest log cabin that Clark had built. And in 1843, he and Mary purchased another 80 acres adjoining the original 80 acres, creating a large 160-acre farm. The land would have been mostly forested originally, with some openings of prairie grasses. It all had to be cleared for farmland, as was true of much of the county. In 1848, when their stone house was built, Jonathan and Mary already had 4 children. By 1857, their family had grown to 8 children, 7 girls and 1 boy. The farm included the big stone house on the left and a large stone barn to the right, along with other farm buildings, and we think the Clark's original shanty or log cabin, which may have been a little farther to the right, or somewhere closer to the house. Do we know? No, we're working on that. All right. That's why I want an archaeological survey. The Clarks had used hired laborers to assist with their farm work. Fred and Lena may have done the same. And in fact, we'll find out something about that, a little more about that in a minute. What did the Beckmans grow? How much did they have? How did they do? We don't know many details. We can probably find more if I get myself to the State Historical Society and look at the 1870 agricultural schedules that were collected with the census and make it very farm by farm detailed information on what was grown. But we do know from the 1870 federal census that it looks like Fred and Lena were doing okay. And by 1870, they had started a family. Their first child, their son Otto, was born in October 1869. Also enumerated with the Beckmans, it says Gottschalk, but if you pronounce it with a hard enough North German accent, you've got Gottschalk, is William Gottschalk, a farm laborer. Was he perhaps a brother-in-law of Charles? I think so, but I just don't know. And Fred and Lena are doing well. They have $1,150 worth of a personal estate, but they don't own any land yet, so there's no value next to that for the value of land. They're renting or leasing. So by 1873, after 5 years of farming, not doing too badly, the birth of two children, Fred and Lena Beckman decided it was time to leave farming and Beckman behind and start another new chapter by getting into the hotel business in Cedar. I call him Fred. In 1873, Fred Beckman went into the hotel business. It may seem an odd progression from teamster to farmer to hotel proprietor, but it turns out that several members of Fred's current and future extended family had experience in the hospitality business. So let's go back to 1850 to discover these roots in the hotel, tavern, and mercantile side of early Cedarburg, and then we'll go forward to see how the village of Cedarburg evolves, keeping in mind that the village was established 3 years before 1850, 1847. And the Beckman family, or at least some of Fred's extended relatives, are already here. Fred, Carl, and the stepchildren and other siblings and his mom and stepfather, they're all back in Mecklenburg in 1850. But some of Ozaukee County's earliest residents were serving guests already. These are two adjacent pages from the 1850 federal census. Starting in the upper excerpt there, we find Hermann and Catherine Rigbers Adler. You might have heard the Catherine Rigbers Adler. They're very early Cedarburg settlers. In 1850, only 3 years after the village was founded, Hermann was earning his living as a cigar maker, and he owned $600 worth of real estate. Not bad. I didn't know you could make that much money making cigars in 1850 frontier America. On the next page, we find Hermann's in-laws, Henry and Anna Rigbers Hackfeld, and their children, Doris, age 6, Anna 5, Lena 3, Lena Hackfeld, age 3. Catherine and Anna are sisters, Rigbers sisters. Another sister, Anna Catherine Rigbers, married a guy named Schumacher, immigrated with all the Rigbers and their husbands, and they live on a farm outside of town. In 1868, 18 years after the census, Henry and Anna Hackfeld's daughter, Lena, will marry 20-year-old teamster Fred Beckman. And note that the Hackfeld family lived at or above, see the red circle? That says tavern. Apparently, Henry Hackfeld ran a tavern. Did this become the saloon side of the Washington House Hotel? Maybe. Pioneer life was difficult. 35-year-old Prussian immigrant, the merchant Hermann E. Adler, husband of Catherine Rigbers, died suddenly from an apocalyptic fit, a stroke. He stroked out in October 1859. Hermann's widow Catherine was only 28, or maybe 31 years old, and would have to carry on by herself. As we will see, Catherine did an admirable job. By mid-1860, when the next federal census was recorded, Catherine, the widow Adler, was 32 years old on the census, had not married again, and was a successful merchant. She now owned real estate worth $1,500 and had a personal estate worth $200. I've not had time to search the Ozaukee County deed books for the Adler real estate transactions, and doing so might tell us more about how the widow Adler managed to grow her wealth during the economic downturn of the late 1850s and early 60s. It was a major economic panic at the time. Somehow, she's making money. Okay. On May 19th, 1868, Catherine Rigbers, the widow Adler, for about 9 years, married Prussian immigrant artist and photographer named Gustav Hodel. They would remain together, successful partners in life and business, until her death in 1889. And as we noted earlier, one of the two witnesses for their wedding was our own Friedrich Fred Beckman. Now, who was Catherine's new husband, Gustav Hodel? Well, Gustav Hodel's life and immigration story is more complicated than some, and I can't get into it from the beginning. For us, the essential information is that he was working as a photographer in Chicago in the early 1860s, and by 1866 or so, He was living and working in Cedarburg and sometimes in Milwaukee. Later on, he was full-time in Milwaukee. But while he was married to Catherine, and his later documents suggest, he and his wife owned and ran a general store which may have been the predecessor of the Wisconsin House, prior to Fred Beckman's purchase of the hotel in 1873. By 1870, the Podol's were successful merchants in downtown Cedarburg. His occupation was running a general store. Hers was listed as keeping house. Gustav was also, I believe, making and selling photographs along with his dry goods, groceries, and merchandise as advertised on the backs of his cabinet card photographs. They had done exceptionally well in the past decade. They now owned $6,000 in real estate and had personal property valued at $2,000. The Podols had resources, and in 1873, they shared some with Catherine's nephew, Fred Beckman. On October 3rd, 1873, only 13 years since arriving in the USA, Fred purchased the Wisconsin House from his wife's aunt, Catherine Riggers Podol, the widow Adler, and her husband, photographer Gustav Podol. Fred paid them $1,450 cash in hand. That's how Fred Beckman gets into the hotel business with family know-how and possibly financial support. Our next stop on the timeline is 1875, 2 years later. In 1875, the Fred Beckman household included 3 males and 3 females. 1 or 2 of these are not members of the Beckman family. They are probably boarders or hired help. 1876 brings us the first advertisement I've seen for Fred's Hotel. This little listing right here in the Polk's Wisconsin Gazetteer and Business Advertiser, 1876 edition. By 1905, the Wisconsin House is purchasing 8-page display ads in Polk's Wisconsin Gazetteer and Business Advertiser. Here is perhaps our best image of Fred Beckman's Wisconsin House. Thank you very much, Joel, without you. During its heyday, it's an undated woodcut, probably circa the 1880s. Note the consistent offer of first-class hotel with fine wines, liquors, and cigars. And the good stabling in connection with hotel is almost certainly that of brother-in-law Charles Gottschalk just across the street. Let's take a closer look at the Wisconsin House building. Compare this with its current incarnation as the Cedarburg Cultural Center. The same place, 2 very different buildings. Fred Beckman's hotel had 2 stories and an attic, and I assume a cellar. Now, a single-story building remains, or has replaced it, I should say. Let's zoom in on a few details here. I love this. Note the large banner painted across the front with the words Wisconsin House. Notice the large banner on top of this flagpole. It's hard to see, but it says Wisconsin House. This is like one of those highway roadside signs. Hampton Inn, this exit. Wisconsin House, this corner of Washington Street. I believe the tavern is to the left of that front entrance. We'll look at that with some more info later. And there's a dining room, a parlor on the right, hotel rooms above. Big sign along the facade, F. Beckman, wines, liquors, and cigars. I'm starting to sense a theme here. In front, stagecoach with 2 horses, the hotel shuttle van of the day, perhaps. The 1880 federal census shows the Podol and Beckman families living close to each other on Washington Street. There are now 4 Beckman children: Otto, Matilda, Friedrich Jr., and someone called Uncle Sam. I don't know why he was enumerated that way. That was the sadly short-lived Theodor Emil Johann Beckman, who only lived 3 years. There are also 3 servants in the home, possibly hotel staff. Cedarburg was growing in the 1880s, and let's get situated. It's map time.
Yeah.
Cedarburg, Wisconsin, 1882 here, 92 on the wall. Fred Beckman, by 1882, had lived in Ozaukee County for 22 years. He'd gone from driving a team for the local mill to farming to owning a successful business. He had a large extended circle of family and friends. In 1882, Cedarburg, as an organized village, was only 35 years old. Let's get a sense of the 1882 Cedarburg by looking more closely at this panoramic map, starting with this area, the red square there on Washington Street. And if we zoom in, first from the key, for some reason, Fred's Hotel, number 17, was labeled a farmer's house on this 1882 map. That's the only time I've ever heard it called anything other than the Wisconsin house. It could be a mapmaker's error, I don't know. Also, across the street, number 23, is the livery stable owned by brother-in-law Charles Gottschalk. And if we pan a little bit to the right, there's Fred's Hotel. Gottschalk is at 23, and over there at 24 is the photography studio of Gustav Podol and Katharina Richter, the widow Adler Podol.
Right. Work policy.
You know what?
For work.
I don't know if that's labeled. It's on some of the maps.
Okay, thanks.
Let me see if I can answer that when we're done here. But it does show up on the maps.
That's that little house that's still around that keeps the now the beauty shop or something.
I don't know.
Yes.
I want to keep going because we have to get through another 3 decades here. And I'd like to invite a few minutes. It's all right. No, I do want to take questions, and I'll come back to that. We have to come back.
I can visit you in that house.
Cedarburg incorporated as a city in 1885, and by 1892, Cedarburg had grown even more. A plat map from the 1892 Atlas of Washington and Ozaukee counties will show us the details. First, we've got a little overview here of the Beckman family in 1885. Henry Hackfeld is just Henry and his wife, Anna Rigbers Hackfeld, living in their house. On the right-hand page underlined, Gustav Podol is living with Catherine and one other woman, perhaps a living servant. And toward the bottom there, you can see the Fred Beckman family with 4 males and 4 females. Not all of these are Beckman children. Probably some servants in there. This year was also important, 1885, for Fred for another reason. On September 1st, 1885, Fred Beckman went to the Circuit Court in Portland, Washington, completed the second and final required document, swore the oath to support the Constitution of the United States, and became a U.S. citizen. Fred was neither especially slow nor quick to complete the citizenship requirements. Henry Hackfeld became a citizen in 1854. Gustav Podol waited until 1892, and brother Charles Beckman didn't receive his citizenship until 1919, a year after the end of World War I. Clearly, changes of all sorts were happening in Cedarburg. So many changes that by 1892, the town needed a new map. By 1892, the extended Beckman family held some substantial land, residential, and business properties in Cedarburg, in particular within the area of this red rectangle. Let's zoom into downtown for a closer look. We are here at the old Hilbin Mill store across the street from the big mill and not far from us. Our Fred Beckman's Wisconsin house, right there. Lena Beckman's 0.9 acres lot and house, which may have been the actual Beckman residence. I'm not clear on that. Following down her side of the street is the Gottschalk livery stable and 2 substantial buildings. Below that, Anna Rigbers has almost 2.5 acres to herself and a house fronting on Washington Street. Anna divorced Henry, or Henry divorced Anna, sometime prior to June 1880. And up in the right corner, in a big triangular lot of 40 acres, is the property of Henry Hackfeld. Let's zoom in a little more on this Washington Street crew. You can see Lena's house on the upper left. Across the street, it says Hotel FB, that's Fred Beckman's Washington, Wisconsin house. There's Charles Gottschalk's place with 2 stables, 2 arrows pointing at that, and there's the Anna Rigbers house. 3 years after that map, in 1895, there was another state census. The 1895 Wisconsin State Census for Cedarburg records that Fred Beckman household included 5 white males and 3 white females. 5 were born in the U.S. and 3 were born in Germany. Also on this, I don't know who the third German is. Actually, I don't know who the other 2 Germans are, because Anita was born here in Cedarburg. Also on the same page are the family of Lena's father, Henry Hackfeld, with 1 male and 4 females, followed by the family of Conrad Wiesler, the husband of Lena's sister, Dora Hackfeld. Yes, and the Wiesler family is the same Con Wiesler that owned the nearby tavern. And they were followed by the household of another of Lena's sisters, Dina or Tina Hackfeld, also called Hafferman or Haberman. There are only 4 females in Dina Haberman's household in 1895, and no males. I don't know all the details, but it appears that her husband, Robert Haberman, died sometime before the 1880 census was enumerated. So she's been hanging on her own with her girls for quite a while now. Lena Beckman's father, Cedarburg pioneer Henry Hackfeld, died on February 20th or 25th, probate documents differ, 1897 at the age of 88. We're running short on time, so I'm not going to read the quotes from the obituary. The short of it is, Henry led a good life, was a prosperous man, and left a good-sized estate, estimated to be worth around $2,500. Henry's death dates are not the same in all sources, including on his Find a Grave entry. His obituary may have been published in early March, but he died in February, and he definitely died in 1897. In any case, Henry Hatfield's estate proved beneficial to his children. $100 went to daughter Dora, the wife of Conrad Wiesler. The remainder was to be divided evenly among all of Henry's children. Son Henry, daughters Dora Wiesler, Anna Becker, Lena Beckman, and Tina, the widow of Happelman. Among the estate's inventory was a large parcel of land that we noted on the 1892 plat map. Following Henry's death, at some point between 1897 and 1915, most of that land ended up in the possession of Lena Beckman. Here's Henry's property in 1892. Keep that in mind, that area outlined in red with the little access road there. As far as I can tell, when this 1882 map was made, there were no homes or other improvements on Henry's property. By 1900, when the map was updated, and you're going to see that, things looked much different. Cedarburg was growing, and Fred Beckman's extended family was part of that growth. Thanks for this, man. In early 1899, Fred announced plans for a new building. Fred Beckman of the Wisconsin House will build an office building adjoining his hotel, which will be leased to the Cedarburg Mutual Fire Insurance Company, whose office is now located in the old Bergenitz building. Work on the new building will commence soon, and they weren't kidding. By the way, I love this thing. Isn't that great on the masthead? It's like putting a rocket ship in the 20th century newspaper. Fred's 1900 Wisconsin House, a year after that announcement, is outlined in detail in the dotted red rectangle. That all is part of the Wisconsin House property. The original hotel with a saloon at the north end of the building remains up facing on Washington, also known as Sheboygan Street. Behind the hotel, there are 2 horse sheds and another much larger addition at the back labeled hotel. I don't know if this was additional rooming or if this was support building or something like that. It's not clear. The newly built office building faces the street. That's the one we just saw advertised. And Lena's house, or is it the family house, is still right here. This part's labeled for a veterinary surgeon. I don't know if she was leasing it out or had a friend who was in the vet business, but having a vet close to several large livery stables seems like a logical idea to me. Let's compare what we know about the Beckman's business growth and expansion in the 12 years between 1892 and 1900. First, looking at our 1892 map, it's not highly detailed, but we can see the Wisconsin house with Lena's or the family's house across the street. We talked about that. Fast forward 8 years to 1900. And we've still got the Wisconsin house upper right, Lena's house. We've seen the buildings at the Wisconsin house. Look at the expanded buildings for the Gottschalk livery stable. He's got a horse shed, wagon shed on the north side of the property, and an expanded livery building along the south edge. And the old Poodle Food Studio still remains on the right, although by 1900, Goose Poodle was totally active in Milwaukee. In 1900, Fred and Lena had been married for 31 years. How does the family look at the turn of the century? The Beckman family includes Fred, age 45, hotel keeper, Lena's 53, the mother of 6 children, 4 of whom are still living. Oops, sorry for that. There we go, sorry. The only child left at home is daughter Agnes, born in January of 85. She's 15 and at school. They have 2 boarders, a millwright and a teamster, both are German immigrants. And they have a servant, one Josephine Schultz, aged 18, born in Wisconsin of German parents. Is she related? Not sure. Just a year later, Cedarburg lost one of its pioneering women when Anna Riggers Hochfeld, Lena Beckman's mother, died on December 31st, 1901. She was 88 years old. It's a nice old bit. I'm going to have to keep pushing it because I still have a few slides. Are we doing okay? The next census for the extended Beckman family was the Wisconsin State Census of 1905. The same year, Fred purchased this handsome advertisement in the Wisconsin State Gazetteer and Business Directory. The 1905 household consisted of Fred, age 60, in the hotel business. He owned the home with a mortgage. Lena was 58, and son Otto Beckman, age 36, was back in the home. He was employed as the Cedarburg city marshal. And the Beckmans had a domestic servant, a 19-year-old Wisconsin-born woman named Clara something I can't remember. When the federal census was enumerated 10 years later, in 1910, Fred and Lena were living on their own. Fred's occupation was listed as own income, which is a 19th century, early 20th century way of saying retired on their own savings. It appears they no longer live in or across the street from the Wisconsin house. The census enumerator has labeled the homes on this part of the page as being on Hilbert Street, which I presume is the modern Hilbert Avenue. One last look at the property. In 1910, the year after Fred retired, he sold the property, and it was owned by a man named Joseph Harris. And either Beckman, toward the end, or Joseph Harris added a bowling alley behind the saloon. And if that's not the most Wisconsin business decision I've ever seen. A year after this, maybe 2, Fred Beckman died. Fred's obituary begins, died at his home in the city at an early hour this morning. Fred Beckman Sr., after an illness of about 9 months, aged 66 years. He was indeed 66 years old if we calculate from Fred's July 30th, 1845 birthday to his death date of May 3rd, 1912. But confusingly, his grave monument gives a death date of May 9th, 1911. Oh. Someone's math is not right, and I think it might have been the stone carver. So, death certificates and passed about 1907 are not freely available on the web. I haven't seen Fred's death certificate, I'm not sure. Lena would live another 6 years. By all indications, she was able to enjoy her final years in comfort, in part because of Fred's success as proprietor of the Wisconsin house, and in part due to a legacy from her father. By the time this map was published in 1915, Henry Hackfeld's property was now the property of Mrs. F. Beckman. That's Lena. She held almost 18 of Henry's original 20 acres, although sometime before this 1915 map was made, about 2 acres of Henry's original 20-acre parcel was sold to others. Lena, one of the first white children born in Cedarburg, died just over 105 years ago, on April 2nd, 1918. She was not quite 71 years old. The local paper published her obituary which included this appraisal of her character. Mrs. Beckman was a pleasant, kind, and venerable lady, and her death was a sad blow for all her relatives and friends. She was buried with Fred and many other members of the extended Beckman family and circle of friends, not far from here at the Tsurua Cemetery. Most of Fred Beckman's adult life took place within a few square miles of south central Ozaki County. He began his American life in Wisconsin as a 15-year-old teamster at the mill in Hamilton. 8 years later, he married Lena Hackfeld, and for the next 5 years, they farmed the land and raised their kids in Jonathan's Park Farm in Beckman. And then Fred Beckman rose to local prominence as the proprietor of the Wisconsin House in downtown Cedarburg. Thanks again for coming out to our get-together on this rainy, now sunny spring Saturday. I hope you've enjoyed our time together and our little sketch of the life of early Cedarburg immigrant Fred Beckman's family and circle of friends. And this is only a sketch. Believe it or not, I cut out a lot of stuff. We know that Fred was active in government as a city alderman. We know he served for many years with the Cedarburg Fire Department, and he was active in fraternal organizations such as the Odd Fellows. There's still much to be learned and said about Fred, Lena, and their lives in early Cedarburg. But now I think, and I hope we have time for some questions. Thank you so much for being here. If I missed anything, please feel free to contact me on my blog. I do Clark House Historian at jchnhistorian.com. There's a contact form that'll go straight to me in my mailbox. That's the email address if you want to directly email me. Don't forget to visit the Jonathan Clark House. Thanks again. And now I'd love to take questions. If anyone's still dreaming.
The son who moved back to his parents' house and was up, what, Marshall?
The city marshal.
Yeah, what's a city marshal?
He was the one and only policeman.
Oh, okay.
He was the chief. He was the chief and the force for many years, several decades. And actually, on the Cedarburg City website, they have history of this, that, and the other thing. There's a picture of Otto with his cap on. I think he was city marshal for decades, and he was one of the first. But actually, I think I don't know if it got on the slides or not. Henry Hackfeld, Fred's father-in-law, was considered to be an early constable or assistant constable as far back as the 1850s, and that's not on the city website. But Otto was considered, if not the first, one of the first police-type persons in Cedarburg.
I don't think they had like a police force yet, so they might not have the records that far back.
The great story I ran into is that Otto wasn't even given a car back in the early 20th century. And so he measured the distance between two lampposts. And as cars would drive by, he'd click with a stopwatch and do the math to see if they were speeding or not. And if they were, he would flag them over. And if they stopped, he would give them the ticket. And if they didn't stop, they didn't stop, and there wasn't much Otto could do about it. That's how tickets were given out in Cedarburg in the early days of automobile travel.
I think the Ozaki County Historical Society has more on Otto.
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, there's
They've been to Otto.
I left a whole lot of you notice I really didn't talk about Fred and Lena's children. I did weeks of genealogy to figure out who was who.
Yeah.
All these Rigbers and Schumachers and Hochfelds, and all of you that have German relations or have done any German surname genealogy, every name is spelled every which way.
Oh, yeah.
And that's entirely normal. Yeah. Partly it's a regional thing. The personal pronoun for I is ich. And it's sort of like standard Middle German, Frankfurt newscaster German, you say ich. And down south in Bavaria, you say ish. And up north around Hamburg and around probably Mecklenburg, Schwerin and Strelitz, you say ich. And so the Rigler surname, Henry Hackfeld's wife, Anna Rigber's, is sometimes Rigbers, and in standard German it's probably like Riechbers I see it spelled Richtbeer,
Yeah.
Richtbeers, CHT even, RICHT. So there are all these variations, and you have to try all the permutations to just find the right, even if they've been indexed passably well.
And then the Americans, when they look at these names, they misspelled on top of that.
Right, you get the whole phonetic thing. It's really quite a conundrum.
You know, you were joking about something about Uline, which is owned by the Uline family,
Right.
and Concordia Mill. And last I heard that Concordia Mill was owned by the Uline family.
Oh, really?
Today.
Today? Yeah.
Last I heard, Marjorie Uline owned it, she's passed away. But there it is, Uline, right there in downtown Hamilton. It's a huge company, isn't it?
Yeah, I live down
You go past it.
I live in Kenosha, and we have this vast, they're building another campus, near the highway. So apparently the cardboard box business is booming. Big,
Yeah.
Anything else?
That's right.
Yes.
I didn't know it, but my grandfather's name was Shreen, or Schwerin, and they're from that area.
Oh, really? Okay.
And I didn't know that until you brought that up here, that this place and my grandparents are kind of together.
And you might notice, if you do any research with 19th century, the 10-year federal census, you know, there is no Germany until 1871 anyway. And so for 1850, 60, and 70, which are 1850 is the first time that everyone's name gets written down on the census. Prior to that, they write down the name of the head of the household, and then they just add up everybody. Family, friends, laborers, or live-in, bartender, whatever. They're all members of the household. So 1850, everybody gets a name, and 1850, 60, and 70 also include where are you from. That happens also later. But those are the three from before German unification. So typically people will say, I'm from Hanover, or Mecklenburg, or Prussia, or Schwerin, or Hessen. And those seem to be some of the popular ones, and Saxony, for people around here. Mecklenburg in the middle of the 19th century had roughly 400 and some thousand residents. In the next half a century, over 100,000 of them came to America. Yeah, because they're just, they couldn't buy the land. Here you could buy land for $1.25 an acre from the government.
And if they owned any land, it was just a little parcel that was divided up.
Subsistence garden, and then you had a few kids. What are you gonna do? Divide the bean patch in quarters? You know? So America had land and the opportunity to work it, make a little money as a teamster, work the land.
My father came here because he was in Germany, and it was an airport. The oldest son inherited the
Yes.
whole thing,
Right.
and the other one.
And everybody else has to
Where they
find
have nothing.
something better.
Go to the
Why,
church or whatever.
Both times, the oldest one got the farm, the next one joined the church and became the bishop.
That's great. The English were very much the same way too, the British Isles.
It's
That was number
interesting.
two.
So,
Everything happens for a reason.
why did Fred's family from
Lucky
New
Catholic
York
Church.
pick this area? It's a great question. Why did the Beckmans and Schultzes come here? A lot of Germans came to Wisconsin. First of all, way back in the 1840s, late 30s and 40s, there were Germans coming to America, and they were like, oh, Wisconsin, the government's going to open up some new land. It's going to be at the opening price before the speculators get to it. Government price, $1.25 an acre. Let's go to Wisconsin, see if we can get some. And they liked it. And they wrote back home. Some of them went back home and came back. Some went back home, and people promoted migrating to Wisconsin in particular. I even have PDFs of there were books published in German and then translated into English. Things like the German Emigrant's Guide to Wisconsin.
It was publicity.
Where do you get on the boat in Germany? How much is it going to cost? What do you need to bring? Once you get to New York, what happens at the docks? Once you get off the docks, how do you get from New York, downtown New York, where you don't know anybody? Well, there's a hotel here. And then after you get transportation, then you can go this way or that way, or you go to Wisconsin. And once you're in Wisconsin, go to Milwaukee, there's a land office there, they'll tell you what's available. And a lot of folks were like, they loved Ozaukee County, they loved they complained about how many trees there were, but they loved the farming once the trees got cut down.
You said they took a boat, right? They didn't take, they climbed a different wagon in.
Well, to get from Germany to America, ship was the only
Right,
thing.
but
From here, it depends when you're going. Before about 1860, there really, well, it depends on the time. First train put together in New York is about 1825 for a little 10-mile stretch to connect two points on the Erie Canal. It's a shortcut where the canal goes this way, the train goes this way. You have more trains. Thanks for coming.
Well, thank you.
Appreciate
Very
it.
interesting.
My pleasure. Send me a note if you want to know more about, what was the name? Was it Words?
Yeah, well, the
Yeah.
worst,
Because I do have them on
Words
some
family.
maps.
Yeah.
So I've got some good CDs.
they were probably compadres by that time.
Everybody either knew everybody or married their
They were
cousins. From about 1825 with the opening of the Erie Canal, really the only way to get to Wisconsin is by boat or a very arduous kind of roadless wagon or horse ride across kind of western New York, Pennsylvania, northern Ohio, northern Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin. People did it, but it was hard.
Which
It
was
was-
more expensive? Like, was it cheaper to take the wagon, that horrible wagon ride, or was it cheaper?
If you already owned the wagon and the oxen, maybe that was cheaper, but it was hard. And then you start to get some semblance of roads, you especially get trains in the later 1850s. None of them come up past Milwaukee until 1860-ish, something like that. And so, but that's Fred Beckman's time. He comes in late 1860. He probably could have gotten a train at least as far as Chicago.
Oh.
And it probably would have been, a couple days train ride, and it would have been just grueling. But it would have been much faster and much safer than, and less, probably less expensive than the boat ride still happening. People still, if you needed to ship heavy goods, you might still be putting them on steamboats coming through the Erie Canal and through the Great Lakes. But by 1860, I'm guessing the Beckmans might have gotten train tickets to at least Chicago and probably Milwaukee. And from there, they're like, oh, Mr. Schmidt's taking a wagon up to Ozaukee. You should, they got some nice land up there. You should oh,
Yeah, and Mr. Turk.
my cousin has a friend who married his sister who's up there already. I think it's around Cedarburg.
Yeah.
That'd be my guess for that.
We've got a, it just made me think about this. We have the Clark House on the library shelf, and I can't remember the author of the title,
That's all right.
but it contains a lot of letters that people were writing back. And it seems like a lot of these ladies would come, and here they are in the wilderness, and they don't know anyone. Maybe there's some other relatives, but they're kind of alone. And so they write back home, and they, like the literature did, oh, this is just the most fantastic place. She doesn't say anything about really terrible things, but she wants her sister and family to come, so she'll have some company, because she's very lonely. I'll see if I can figure out which book that is.
Well, and you also have, there's a phenomenon called cluster migration. Where a bunch of people maybe from this little town, a couple families, half dozen families, a dozen families, will come kind of as a group. Freistadt communities, a classic example of that. But then they all write home. They say, by the way, this is nice, and we're setting up, we have a church, we have a farm, we have a thing. Somebody built a mill, team put a dam across the river, and they have a mill, and it's great. You should come, and people came. And so you get these kind of like related or at least friendly with the relations kind of migrations. And it's so typical, especially kind of the overseas immigrant migration, but it happens in country some too. Where you'll have like people from a certain part of like New York or New England or southern Quebec. Oh, I'm in Wisconsin. Yeah, I'm tired of this. I'm tired of living out in the boondocks in southern Quebec. I'm going to go to the soon-to-be prosperous and bustling Wisconsin.
But then when they came to Milwaukee, your ancestor, Peter
My
Church was
great
there,
great grandfather Peter Church
and
was
he
sitting
says,
there
come
going,
on out to Mecklenburg.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So the
I'll
Bible
give you a lift. Come up
Fresh
in that
Stars
mess.
came out, they came with
He's a
your,
big promoter.
If the Freishtonners come because of church.
oh, yeah,
Oh,
yes, they write that,
They're
they
right.
write that in their history.
Well, I want to
They
see
met a
it. I
man
haven't
named
seen
Peter
it.
Church who was, what did they say, he was a hunter or something? They
Right.
made it sound, hunter and trapper or something, they made it, I mean, we,
Yeah, he
Oh,
hunted and trapped immigrants.
so he said to the Freishtonners, come out to this place in Mecklenburg, there's land available.
Well, that's why the
So
Bonnie
they
Wells
came-
came.
Yeah.
And he did the same thing with him. He
Turk
was a
went-
hustler. Can you imagine his ancestor was a hustler?
Turk was in Milwaukee apparently
Tell us
all the time.
Yeah.
And he was in Milwaukee.
Yeah.
The Bonnie Wells get off the boat in 1839.
Yeah.
And he's like, oh, I'm up on Pigeon Creek. You should,
They
there's
already
nice
have a
land.
sawmill.
Nice land around here. I got a sawmill. I'll sell you the boards. You put up houses. It's gonna be great. We'll name the district after you.
Yeah.
There's so many. And so the Bonnie Wells came up. Turk also was, I ran into his name enticing someone else. And off the top of my head.
Yeah, we know it's the Bonnie Wells and the Freishtonners.
I want to find out that fresh stuff. That's interesting.
Yeah, it might be online on their history.
Okay, I will check that out.
Yeah.
So, you know, even we think Jonathan may have been born in Stansted County,
Yeah, right.
Quebec, which is now southern Quebec with Lower Canada.
You know, it's.
Just build this in-
There was a big family there, and everybody in that part of Canada came from New England. They were Americans that moved north for more space, more land, whatever.
Yeah.
A little pioneering adventure.
Yeah.
That was the easiest way to access that part of Canada. It was very hard to get to from Montreal or Quebec City. So they all came from northern Vermont and New Hampshire. A bunch of them, including a family called the Rix family, R-I-X.
Here, in Mecklenburg.
There's a famous story published, a first-person anecdote of how one Rix, and I forget his first name, loaded up a wagon and came from Stansted, Canada, down through Vermont, New England, New York, across under the Great Lakes, by wagon, all the way, and they settled in Polk Township. And they made friends with another one of my relatives and another Clark House relative. One of the Clark daughters, Elizabeth Clark, married Densmore Maxon. Or no, I'm sorry, Elizabeth Turk, Peter Turk's daughter. Elizabeth Clark married a different guy, Carl. Elizabeth Turk, Mary Clark's sister, married an early pioneering surveyor named Densmore W. Maxon. And Maxon laid out the village of Cedar Creek. It's called Cedar Creek.
No,
Right?
it's
Where's it right in the middle?
Yeah.
Well, there's the township,
Yeah.
and then the middle there's a hamlet.
There is a little.
Cedar Creek. And he planted that, and he gave himself nice sawmill property. Put up a sawmill, a creamery that turned into a cheese-making concern. And the Maxons were there. They have a farmhouse that still exists just north of town. They have a burying ground where a whole bunch of these people that we know are buried. And the Rixes moved in right next to the Maxons and set up a farm there. And this whole Rix, Maxon, Turk, Clark connection comes together in the whole township. And these are the same ones that we have a first-person memoir of how they got with the wagon, including the like little kids walking and a baby in mom's arms kind of thing. How did the women put up with this nonsense? Was it really that awful? And it's like, sure, honey, let's walk from Quebec to Wisconsin in 1843 or whatever.
They were
Finding your roots, and,
Yes.
Paul Ryan knows about his Irish side, but he didn't know anything about the German side.
Okay.
From his mother's, and they apparently had enough money to make the trip, and then they sold all of their possessions that they brought along with them, because by the time they got to Milwaukee, they were broke. They came by the, water. And then they had $12, and that got them to Madison. But they wanted to go to a German settlement about 50 miles north. The woman was pregnant.
Oh.
She's walking, she's like 5 months pregnant.
These 19th century women, they're amazing.
And they survived. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the ones that survived, and there are a lot that didn't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're the gutsy ones.
Yeah.
Well, like some of the ones you mentioned.
Well,
were successful.
at some point, I'm gonna blog about, the 1850 mortality schedule. There are about 5 pages for, what would become Mozambique County, the eastern part of Washington County. And, not only do we find, I'm not gonna transcribe, there's 20, 30 names on a page, but it's worth looking at to see what was killing them. And essentially, very young people die, very old people die, and a smattering of kind of middling aged folks die. But most of them are really young or rather old. But it's, the usual suspects, cholera, scarlatina, the occasional apocalyptic fit. A fair number of what would appear to be unsuccessful childbirth for either the woman or the infant. And then, for some reason, in the 1850 census, the enumerator wrote a little paragraph on the bottom of a couple of pages. And it talked about, well, we had a lot of cholera after all the rain in the spring, and then we had a drought. So it's actually kind of interesting background. Because we really don't have newspaper coverage in this part of the world outside of Milwaukee. We don't have newspaper coverage in this part of the county, at least.
1883.
Yeah, there are some early papers. Most of the issues have not survived. There's microfilm that one can look at the Historical Society. So someday I'm going to try and mine that.
But the very fact that a lot of people say, well, what did Jonathan Clark die of? We don't know.
I wish I knew,
Probably not a disease that was communicative, because otherwise some other people in the family might have gotten it,
Yeah. Cholera is certainly a thing, funky water.
Yeah.
Where was how close to the house wasn't it pretty?
But it could have been, a stroke, it could have been all kinds of things.
How do you know when to stop?
He does.
And you don't know.
Have you read the Little House on the Prairie books? The Little House books? First of all, my wife and daughter read those together, and I read a fair amount of them with my daughter when she was little, and they're very interesting. The Little House books are the Turk Clark story. Peter Turk, he's comes from a well-established family in a well-established part of the Hudson River Valley with all these Dutch ancestors, 200 years of Dutch ancestors. And he's like, well, you know what? I got all these brothers and sisters, and it's crowded here in Columbia County, New York, on the Hudson River, south of Ulm. Let's go out, they're building a canal. Let's go out and get some land not far from the canal, and we'll build a farm, and we'll build a church, because he was a Baptist preacher. I'll preach a little. So we went out to Palmyra, New York, which is an interesting historical town for a lot of reasons. And I've been to Palmyra, very briefly. And he bought a piece of land, held it for a bit, bought another piece of land, sold that, bought a different piece of land a little closer to the river, a little farther west, in a little town called Macedon, and put up a church in Macedon, which is the First Baptist Church still exists. I think he was the first preacher, or one of the first. And then he's like, in 1836, he's got a 3-year-old boy. Was she pregnant? I can't remember. But anyway, they got a bunch of little kids, and no one's older than about, Mary was the oldest,
right?
She was 17, I think. And they're like, you know what? Let's take one of those canal boats to Buffalo and take us freaking steamer to Wisconsin. And they loaded up the family, and they must have brought like the sawmill blade
Yeah.
at least, right?
Something.
Something to
Yeah,
cut
to
with,
start.
right? You gotta, don't forget the bag, honey.
Yeah.
Don't forget the blade when we pack. And they come out, and when they got to Milwaukee, and Milwaukee complained about this for decades, there was no good pier, there was no
No, it's-
landing, so they had to use lighter boats to unload all the stuff and send it into the shore, and then the men would get out, and carry the women and the baggage through the mud onto the beach. And then he's like, oh, no, Milwaukee seems nice, there's probably a couple, maybe 1,000 people here, but you know what? Kind of crowded. I hear if we go 16 miles north on the Milwaukee River, there's a nice wide spot with a creek, Pigeon Creek, and we'll put up a sawmill and a house. And why Mrs. Tripp put up with that, I have no
And then she had her 8th child.
Right, and Benjamin was born in 1839. So 2 years later, and I think his next closest sibling was maybe 5 years older than he was. And then a year later, after 1839, Mary marries Jonathan Clark. In the early part of 1840, and about 8 months later, their first child. What are these? That's the guys. It's always none of these women are going, you know, the house is nice. You finally put glass in the windows.
Yeah.
And I got some lace curtains down at the Mercantile. Let's move. It can't be the women saying this. It's got to be the guys. You know, honey, you did a nice job here. Let's do something else. And if you look at those Little House books,
Yeah.
Wisconsin, that's
Oh, if you go over that
Minnesota,
part of
then they go to here. then they
Wisconsin,
come back.
Minnesota, Iowa, every little town says they live there.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Very recently, PBS did one of those American Experience programs about the wild, about Laura Ingalls Wilder, who
Yeah.
wrote the books,
Yeah.
and about her pa and her mom, and
Yeah.
where and about Laura Ingalls Wilder's daughter, who was her secret editor,
Yes.
and helped shape the books.
I thought you were gonna say secret enemy, because
No.
two of them like.
Well, they did, because, you know, mom was like, oh, I just like to write my stories, and the daughter's like, yeah, but I actually know how to write. She's a professional writer.
Yeah.
It's like, you got the best anecdotes, and I love your, you know, the way you express yourself, but we gotta put some structure in these stories, because they zigzag all over.
Yeah. So that's nice.
Yeah.
No,
Her
but
mother was the first born in Brookfield, our Ingalls Wilder mother was the first being born in Brookfield,
Yes.
but she was a girl, so we didn't record her there.
Isn't that nice? We're trying to do that again.
No.
Let's go back to that old law.
We're going back to 49, why not? That 1849. I mean, but
Well,
yeah.
thanks, Reed. This
Well,
is-
golly, thanks for coming, I appreciate it, I hope you enjoyed it.
Very good. It's just one door.
But you're right, it had
to
to be
the next
nice.
one.
I mean, I.
There's so
when
many
I read-
rabbit holes.
When I read
Did you write
the
down
Wild
that website?
No,
Was it,
the Durham.
Oh, my resorts, here,
How do you spell it?
MEYEORTS,
It is like
Y-A-R-R.
anywhere.
and I'll show you that.